get an invitation to accept the recording. And also to say, please use the Q&A function at the bottom to ask questions, and then remember you can upvote, and I will try and reflect those questions to the panel. Right, Juliet, welcome. Did you led the business discussion, I think? Do you want to feedback?
Yes, we had a full and wide-ranging conversation. So I'll try and summarise it, because we did go from apprenticeships to synthetic fuels. So quite a large remit. But so first of all, where we started was training and education. It was very much felt that we needed to make sure we were investing in training in our own people within business, but also for school leavers and graduates, to make sure they have the skill sets and capabilities to be able to come and take on some of the challenges we're seeing as far as climate change. Particularly was called out the apprenticeship schemes and what more could come out of the apprenticeship schemes and be taught, whether it's practical skills of installing a heat pump or installing insulation, through to kind of more more specific capabilities in kind of doing assessments and climate assessments for business. One of the things that was really coming out was that there seems to be a big demand for business to be doing much more on carbon zero and reducing their carbon, but there wasn't necessarily the capability and the resources from local businesses to be able to satisfy that demand. And so that came to our second point, is that how do we support local businesses to play a bigger role in reducing carbon? And I think one of the first ones was, can we make sure we simplify the grants system? So where there are grants available for them to do work like the green grants, it's made easy and practical to get your hands on. Secondly, can we provide and support collaboration amongst small businesses? So quite often the business might not have all the technical capability to do a job, but they might want to find a partner to do with that. Can we collaborate and bring small businesses together? And then also potentially using wider networks on how can we make sure that we educate small businesses in terms of what the possibilities are. Particularly, we touched on innovation at the end. How is innovation funding flowing through into SMEs in the region? How are we using kind of world-leading science that we have in the environmental sector particularly, and make sure that businesses are able to take up that? We did talk about synthetic fuels at one point, whether that we should be looking at synthetic fuels for the vehicles that aren't going to be electrified. We also touched on the impact of green consumers and the circular economy. We touched on waste and how can we minimize waste. There were some great comments that were coming out of that. And a lot of those were asking for more regulation in terms of actually persuading making it that companies do have to do something about the consumer waste that their product is delivered in, particularly fast food. And then I think that was the majority of it, but I have undoubtedly missed out some of it. But there was an underlying theme of education throughout the whole piece, and how do we make sure we've got the skilled workforces that we need for the future.
Thank you very much indeed. Great, lots there to discuss. Paul, you were leading on food and farming.
I was, and funnily enough, what Juliet and Ariane said is what people said in a weird sort of way. So there were discussions around not synthetic fuels, but synthetic foods. So where do we get our food? How do we get our food? And actually what Ariane was saying around apprentices. So there was concern about how the county, how the council looks after its county farm estate and what it is to have county farms, and actually how people could be given apprenticeships, which actually led into, there was another point around how we can encourage young people into farming and actually promote it as a positive thing to be doing. I mean, I suppose one of the things that is food and farming is because we're consuming food all the time and we're all very much connected with what it is to have our landscape. People are exceptionally passionate about what this whole topic. Trying to distill everything is very difficult, but I kind of picked up perhaps three different themes. One being connection, and people need to be supported with how they make their choices around food and climate change. And actually there was kind of a feeling that actually there isn't enough information around in terms of how you make those choices when you go to buy a particular product and how you're able to value it. And then also a point around how you know what has happened. So someone saying how much good has been done on farms, but you generally don't hear about how this has been done and what the value is. And the same actually goes for farmers. They generally don't know what has happened with regard to the schemes and things they've entered into. Another theme is around getting it right. So having the right technique. So there was obviously right techniques and right land and right type of farming. So there was conversations across everything from having less meat or having no meat to having no pesticides, to concern about neonicotinoids and bees, through to having agroecology and regenerative farming. So it was a lot of conversation about doing the right thing in the right place. And then I suppose the final part was around support to get it right. So an awful lot of people saying we need to buy locally, but then the point being made that actually, is that necessarily affordable? So how can we help people to do all of that? And then actually an allied point, which is how can you make sure the costs are in the product so that people are actually connected with it? So I think they were kind of the three big parts. There was an awful lot around as well, the planning system. So how we look after our best and most versatile land.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Okay, tremendous. Well, I was dropping in and out of the rooms as well, and so much, there's kind of wealth of issues there. The Q&A function is open, so please do put in. I'm going to come to questions to the panel in a second. Just two ones particularly from me. One is I haven't heard much today about transport, and I'm glad you discussed that, Ariane, in your meeting. Can you just give us a sense? I don't know if this is quite in your remit, but electric vehicle charging, and someone's asked about this as well in the Q&A. What's the sort of Wiltshire strategy on getting more, enabling more EV, and then electric vehicles? And then I've got a kind of broader question. I'll give us a quick answer on that, Ariane, and then I'll come to my broader question.
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to get our own house in order first. So at the moment, what we're trying to do is we're trying to electrify our own fleet as a council and get the funding together to change our fleet over to electric vehicles and put in electric vehicle charging points in our depots. So that's what we're starting with at the moment. We've got the local transport plan. The fourth iteration of our local transport plan will have to have quite a wide-ranging strategy relating to decarbonising transport. My colleagues in transport planning are dying to get their hands on the decarbonising transport policy document that's due to come out from central government, which has been delayed, but we understand it's due by Easter. And I think that is what's needed from central government to drive the local transport policy here in Wiltshire. So hopefully, you probably know more about this than I do, but hopefully that will be coming forward very soon, and that will help us then set our own policies locally.
Okay. Well, I can definitely put on that.
Danny, there is also a consultation on EV charging out at the moment for the Department of Transport, which is well worth a read and important. Particularly, that's making sure that consumers are protected, and they're looking at making sure that, because a lot of charging points, the original charging points, have not been very effective, particularly the ones on the motorways where they haven't worked. But they're looking to enforce a 99% uptime. So in other words, they're looking to bring in some legislation. I think it would be really useful if people are interested to input that if it's important.
Brilliant. Okay. I just want to come to Nick and Juliet with this question, which is a more general one in response to all of the comments that have been made, which is, and particularly in the early presentation from Gemma about her work with farmers. And really it's the question, and for me as a Conservative, I'm conflicted here about whether we basically trust entrepreneurs or not. And there seems to be a tension, particularly in what you were saying, Juliet, about helping, you were basically politely saying, everyone wants businesses to do more, but it's quite hard because local businesses in particular, if they don't have the capacity to do that, which I think might be interpreted as the will to do it as well. But can you both just give us your thoughts on the tension between basically deregulating and in the expectation that people will seize market opportunities, do the right thing because it's the right thing, respond to pressure, versus basically telling businesses what to do. Just a minute on each of those, Nick. First, then.
I'm going to be just ruthlessly talk about my own experience in our own business. So we're building a local energy market with government innovation funding in Liverpool at the moment, so which would allow participants to trade across the local DNO network. And we have prime funding from government, but what we do require is some intelligent regulation that will allow entrepreneurialism as well as new technology into the space, because we know we can harness investment. There's plenty of money around. There are technological solutions around, but regulation, as ever, is lagging and is not as smart as it needs to be. And actually, our dialogue and our learning from our project, we're desperately trying to get that in this instance into Ofgem, to get them to respond, to get them to open up these markets so entrepreneurs can experiment. So it's a bit of both. We've got to learn to sort of dance together, and I think the regulators need to trust the entrepreneurs that they're not going to be ripped off. The government's not going to be, somehow committed to long-term investment decisions, and that actually it's going to bring in private investment. So it's going to kind of unleash entrepreneurialism. That's certainly my private experience in my company. Over to you, Juliet.
Yeah, I would agree with what Nick said in terms of that particular style of regulation. We did a very similar project up in Scotland where we were trying to supply locally from a local renewable generator to local community, and you can't do that basically under the current legislation. So that is because you've got some quite draconian rules which are sort of basically overseen and only really understood by very few players in the market. And that's one of the biggest challenges, is to kind of break that open to allow the entrepreneurs in. In terms of balancing that with, do we trust entrepreneurs? One of the things I do think we do need to step up is consumer regulation and looking after consumers, the end user, to make sure that the promises that are being made in the market are actually that stand up to scrutiny. And there is no scrutiny at the moment in this marketplace. You can make a green claim and nothing can happen to you because nobody has the details of whether it's truly green or not green. It is something that we've been talking to the Energy Ombudsman about, and we think their remit should be reinforced as we move into a world where greenwashing becomes more and more prevalent. But also we think, I know BEIS is doing a review at the moment, and the CMA is actually investigating this as well. But we think it's a really important point. So Danny, I completely agree with you. I think let entrepreneurs come in and do what they're good at, but make sure you protect the consumer in the meantime.
Great, thank you both very much. Okay, I'm going to now, as it were, open to the floor, by which I mean I'm going to read out some questions, which have been basically voted on by the audience on the priority. So Richard Eccleston is asking quite a long question. I'll try and summarise, which is basically saying that leadership is vital. This is an emergency. We need an emergency response from government that reflects the seriousness of the challenge, moving much more quickly. How can our local MPs put more effective pressure on the government? He was underwhelmed by Andrew Griffiths, sadly. Appreciate this is a political question, but tough. You lot.
It came up, Danny. It came up in our session. So
tell me how basically you think if the government's doing enough or not.
Too timid, I think. So our group was saying it's too timid, and actually, what it hasn't really realised is there's a tremendous willingness to align on this agenda, and if it could be more ambitious and deliver on some of its promises. The Green Homes Grant was mentioned this morning, but unfortunately sort of tripping itself up a bit there. And actually, if it could engage with civil society a bit more effectively on this topic, it could go further. So rather than being a political risk, which is perhaps how it's considered at the moment, it's an opportunity. That would be my view.
Great.
And what I heard as well.
Yes, thank you. Paul, do you want to answer?
Yeah, I mean, the thing for our sector is there is so much in flux at the moment. So the support systems are changing, the way in which we trade is changing. The conversation just now around regulations, I mean, I deal with regulations all the time, and they're exceptionally complicated, and the way they are being administered and dealt with is changing. And I think from the farmer's point of view, what we need to do is have some clear sight in terms of what is happening, where there is going to be support, because otherwise I think it is very difficult for people to make choices in terms of where their businesses should be. And it's getting that, the clarity is, I think, what we need, rather than kicking it further down the road. And it's just getting clarity in terms of where we're going for a whole load of different things at the moment.
Thank you very much, Paul. Ariane.
Yeah, so I mean, I think in terms of what more central government could do to support local government in these ambitions, I think there are a few clear areas. I mean, the one that kept coming up in it again and again is in terms of planning policy. So the national planning policy framework doesn't allow us to go at the moment as far and as fast as we would like to go in terms of setting zero carbon standards for all new build. And that's something which really needs to come centrally, so that otherwise the house builders will just be playing off different local authorities against each other, which is really not helpful. So that would be an area where strength and policy would be great. I think the other areas around transport and assessing the carbon impacts of different transport schemes and funding for active travel, but devolve to local authorities in a way where we can actually enable local communities to design the solutions for themselves and find solutions that work for them, because I think the latest emergency active travel funding with the pop-up cycle lanes showed what happens when you do something without that consultation and engagement. In some places it backfired spectacularly. Right. So
okay, point taken, especially on the planning, and I totally agree there's a lot to improve there, and I very much support the efforts to get more power into the hands of not just councils but communities as well, and we've got to get the neighbourhood planning process to actually do what it's supposed to. Aaron, thank you. Juliet.
So I think one of the biggest challenges we come across is there's some big sort of headline legislation that comes through where you can see some leadership. One of the biggest problems we have is lots of small pieces that always seem to be a backward step. So there's a really tiny mod in one of the pieces of the Electricity Act that's going through that nobody understands. And we've just discovered that it means that small renewable generators could be charged an extra £70,000 a year as a result of this particular mod, which we're trying to remove. Our view is that we should have a no backward step on climate, so that any legislation or any modification or any code should have climate written into it, so that it basically can't go backwards. Because what we see is that the main policies are pushing ahead, but if everything else is fighting against it, then it finds it really difficult. And then that should be across all departments. So it should be across Treasury, it should be across education, it should be across local government, because what we want to do is that smaller steps will be able to take us further forward. Otherwise, everything will cost us a lot more money.
Okay, thank you. Does that apply to new coal mines as well?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, let's go to the next Q&A. Richard Eccleston, who's asking popular questions, is asking whether Wiltshire MPs will support the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill. So I think this is the bill that was brought in last year, which we either abstained on or voted against, forgive my memory, on the grounds that although the ambitions of it are very laudable, the measure to set up a climate panel and make its conclusions binding on Parliament, we regarded as against the principle of parliamentary sovereignty and representative democracy. So I take that view strongly. So I very much support climate assemblies. Actually, and it was a backer of the one that got reported in last year, and supported that process. I think it is a really helpful thing to do. I'm not sure we should subcontract decision making to front binding decision making to an assembly. I think that is what Parliament's for. So that's my primary objection to that bill. But I might have misunderstood or got it wrong. But that's my immediate response to Richard's question. I look forward to the chat. Okay. Ruth has asked about an Ecocide Law that the EU in the process of making. So let me put that to everybody, as well as I think we've discussed the degree of the role of national and local from Adam's question. So forgive me for skipping that. And also about innovation and private sector expertise. So we've done that. And we discussed transport a bit. So let me move on. Sorry, I'm just being a bit brutal here. We've only got a minute left. So Ecocide Law, is there some sort of, I mean, maybe the law that Juliet just proposed would be an interesting way of getting into that, of no backward steps. But also, can you all just quickly talk about rewilding? Should more grants for rewilding non-profitable farmland be introduced? Everyone answer that, or give one last comment. I'll go round, and then I'm going to invite Claire O'Neill, formerly Claire Perry, to join us in the panel. I hope you lot will stay with us for final bit of this session, but I'm going to go around you all now and get your final thoughts, randomly starting with Paul.
Randomly on rewilding. Do you know what? Just because of that word, I think we have to be very careful with how we use our language, and how we actually need to be able to understand where everyone is coming from much better, and to be able to use language which doesn't polarize and create conflict. So within farming, it turns out that rewilding can be quite a difficult term, but actually an awful lot of farmers are doing an awful lot of what could be rewilding. It just doesn't sit underneath it. So it's trying not to be pejorative and just trying to get our language right, because if we do that, we'll find that actually we can get an awful long way.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Nick.
Actually, knowing a few farmers locally, I think I could ask them which of their fields were unproductive because of their geology, and they might be suitable for rewilding. So I think in the right place, in consultation with the landowners and the land managers, I think there's always land that could be put into more productive outcomes, which might be rewilding.
Thank you. Ariane, please.
I mean, I suppose in terms of the council, the most obvious initiative we've got is around improving the biodiversity of our highway verges, and a lot of town and parish councils are also taking action to do that. There's a lot of now wildflower planting all across the county, so I think we're all going in the right direction on that. There's obviously a lot more we can do.
Thank you very much. Juliet.
I was going to mention Ecocide Law, if that's okay, Danny, because I think rewilding, everybody's pretty covered. So Ecocide is really interesting. It's the equivalent of having, instead of human rights, you've got planetary rights, essentially environmental rights. And it's a kind of, it is a way of rethinking how we think our future. And one of the reasons I do think it's something that we should be looking at and putting some intellectual thought into is because there's a brilliant cartoon that I can't remember which cartoonist wrote it, and there's a couple of people huddled around a fire, and one of them is a pension fund manager, and said, for a while we had some great returns, but obviously we have no planet left to live on. So I think one of the things is that we do need to look into this future world and what we are doing to the planet in the process. And if we're not there, if the planet isn't there to look after us in the future, what's the point in having a pension?
Great. Okay, thank you. Well, I've tried to put that into a question without being too leading. Should ecocide be illegal? While we're waiting for that to conclude, can I thank the panel very much? Please stay on if you're able to stay for the next half hour, for the final half hour, because I'm now going to ask Claire to join us. Oh no, so she's been promoted. Brilliant. Claire, you need to come on video and off.
Hello.
There you are. Tremendous.
How exciting. Hello, old friends. Nice to see some of you again.
Claire, you're very welcome. Known to everybody here, no doubt, as my superior predecessor, and also, of course, as briefly the chairman of the COP26 climate change conference, and you might want to talk about your experience doing that. But anyway, we're very pleased to see you. Thank you very much. I don't know how much you've been able to catch of.
I have been listening with interest. Look, it's great to see everyone, and as always, fantastic to hear the level of knowledge and interest from those in the Devizes constituency. A lot of people have been working on this for a very long time, and as you all have heard, Danny, a lot of the arguments and the understanding is quite sophisticated. Hi, Ruth, nice to see you. So it's a real pleasure to join you and to keep up this fantastic work that the constituents want to do, and to really listen, which I think there's a real appetite to have the politicians listen and reflect it back. I thought I'd share, if it was helpful, a couple of sort of macro thoughts, because I've been on this climate journey since being a geographer at university 30 years ago, and it's rare that your childhood interests correspond with what you want to do in politics. But as the Clean Growth and Energy Minister in Theresa May's cabinet, I was extraordinarily lucky to be there at an incredibly important time and bring in the clean growth strategy, the net zero legislation, the Powering Past Coal Agreement, and really support a lot of the other incredibly important things that happen, particularly in DEFRA, where I think we've made some great progress. As Danny said, I served as the COP president designate for Glasgow for 6 months before Dominic Cummings decided I was superfluous to requirements, but I'm very pleased that Alok has taken on that job full time. And I think we have a real moment this year to really demonstrate and actually underpin UK leadership. And you know, from as much as we can always say politicians never do enough, it's really hard to fault actually what the government is doing, particularly with the 10-point plan. So I've got some thoughts on what the action decade, which we're in, needs to look like, but I thought I might just start, if it's remotely interesting, with a couple of kind of pieces of context. If you'll just bear with me to share my screen, because it wouldn't be Zoom without sharing the screen. Let's see if I can get it up. Make this work. Let's come back in a second. You'd have thought I'd be better at this by now. Let's get this up. Oh, is it going to work? Share. There we go. Is that, everyone can see that okay? It should be bigger, I guess, but there we might just have to run it on that basis. So, by the way, I changed from Perry because it felt unfair to my current husband, my last husband, to have my first husband's name when I left politics. So, as many of you will know, and many of you have been on this journey for a long time, you know, we're seeing a kind of historic peak in this interest over the concept of climate change. And what, of course, is fascinating is in the UK, sometimes that isn't always translating into votes at the ballot box. But over the last, since 2006, when Al Gore did his amazing piece, we've seen this extraordinarily strong focus now on concern over climate change. And the thing that keeps me awake at night, and if you'll just bear with me to play this, I think this is a Twitter account that we should all follow, because this is the Keeling curve, the track of CO2 from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, and it's really terrifying. Just bear with me for 1 minute while it plays out. And the thing that is so terrifying from that a little graphic for me is not only this extraordinary sense of just bursting through any boundaries that we've ever experienced as a kind of agrarian society, but also the fact that the curve keeps going up. So the Keeling curve is at about 418 parts per million today. COVID has had the effect of dropping energy demand globally by about 8%, but the rebound is already happening. And I guess that the question for me is that business as usual and politics as usual are just not going to make a difference. And the question we ask ourselves is, well, how bad could it get? And the last time we had CO2 levels at this high, the temperature was 3 to 4 degrees higher than it is now. Sea levels were up to 20 meters higher, and beech forests were growing on the South Pole, as Captain Scott so memorably found. It was a completely different and very ice-free world. And of course, the question is, are we heading in that direction? Can we stop it? What can we do to hold back? The first world leader to ever speak about the dangers of global warming, I know I used to say this a lot when I was your MP, it was indeed Mrs. Thatcher, who talked about it at the UN General Assembly in the 1980s. Why? Because she was a scientist, and it was the first time those scientific voices had actually been listened to by global politicians, and we've spent an awful lot of time since then denying scientific proof, and nothing more depressing than when you hear global politicians pretending that the scientists are wrong. And it, of course, has some resonance for the COVID conversations that we're currently having. You all know about the COP, that this was the first Rio Earth Summit in 1992, was set up as the place where the world was going to come together and try and grow in a sustainable way. After that, the COP process was set up, and these constant questions of who pays, how do you balance development, historical development in the the northern half of the globe with development in the southern half. And this has played out now for about 25 years. And this report card that was set up for the UN Convention on Climate Change basically gave us an F for stabilising greenhouse gas emissions. Since the Rio Earth Summit, emissions have gone up by over 50%. And yes, a process has been set up. The COP does happen, it runs along, it's a huge kind of focus event every year, but the actual deliverables have been quite small. Well, but you'll say, well, but hang on, the Paris Agreement was an amazing achievement, and indeed it was. It was the most extraordinary diplomatic lift. But it is an entirely voluntary set of agreements. It's basically show up every 5 years with a ratchet for your own domestic contributions, and we will work together to hold temperatures below 2 degrees above their pre-industrial levels. It's an extraordinary thing, but it has no mandation. There is no global legal framework to enforce the outcomes of COP. And my experience, having attended several COPs over the last few years, is that at worst, it can descend into a kind of zero-sum game talking shop. And the real opportunity this year is to get people out of that closed space and thinking very hard about the real world. I'll share with you one thing. In Madrid last year, we had 500,000 climate protesters outside, and I sat in a plenary, as they're called, with all the negotiators, where we debated for half an hour as to whether the meeting we were in should be classified as an informal or an informal. And my take on this was that we had to break this mold, that the COP could not continue in its current form. It had to be energised to focus on the real issue. So as we look forward to this year, running into Glasgow, you know, is it any better? And the answer is yes. You know, as you've been hearing about, there have been huge technology and economic gains. We now have renewables, offshore wind in the UK that is now price competitive, albeit with some contractual structuring on behalf of the auctions, but essentially price competitive with fossil fuels. It is amazing what we've done in the UK. I mean, we are an island of coal surrounded by fish, and yet we've essentially extracted coal from our generation system by using gas as well as renewables, and dropped our emissions down to levels that were last seen when Queen Victoria was on the throne. We were the first country to legislate for net zero in law. We've set up the Climate Change Committee. We've now said that companies have to have mandatory risk reporting when they're reporting their accounts. It truly is great, and I do appreciate all the calls for us to do more and to go further, but I actually think we should be quite proud of what we have achieved, because it shows it can be done. And if you can put it on a statutory footing going forward, it can continue. The scientific pace is growing ever stronger. We're seeing companies and sectors now falling over themselves to set net zero targets, but also to set negative emissions targets, to reclaim and go beyond every particle of CO2 that they've ever emitted. And as you've started to hear today, you're seeing cities, states, counties, regions starting to flex their policy muscles and, you know, essentially say we can do more. Really interesting to hear the conversation about nature positive solutions. Obviously, rewilding is quite controversial, but I think for the first time, this sense that what we need to do for the climate can also have huge co-benefits for the natural world is now very much front and centre. And thank God, I can say that now for the US election. Extraordinary to see Joe Biden re-elected and John Kerry, who was a giant, quite literally, he's very tall, but also diplomatically, in the Paris COP, now basically incredibly committed to the success of Glasgow. The UK being an ambitious host, China setting out their net zero by 2060 plan, albeit, you know, the devil's in the detail with the Chinese proposals. And frankly, the EU demonstrating extraordinary leadership and being the only region to talk about carbon adjusted trade policy, and also having a very substantial financial commitment to the green Build Back Better narrative. But it's not all good. Oh, I seem to have, there we go. What are the negatives? As I mentioned, the COP process is unbelievably difficult. It is at best a spotlight moment. It is very hard to achieve something meaningful in those negotiations. In fact, the only things on the table to negotiate this year are the closing of the Paris rulebook, which is not a moment that will get the pulses racing. What will happen at COP is all the stuff that goes around it, the commitments from sectors, from cities, to phase out fossil fuel vehicles, for example, the commitments on finance, this sort of action in the real world that is so incredibly important. One thing I felt very strongly in my former life and now is I think the conversation we have, though, is all too often amongst ourselves. So if you travel to India, if you travel to China, if you speak to the 800 million people who have no access to electricity currently, the energy transition looks really, really different to those parts of the world. And it becomes very hard to argue against, for example, their desire to rapidly get off coal, that's great, but potentially to increase levels of gas in the mix. And I think we have to recognise that the conversation about climate change is all too often ignoring voices from the developing South who might have very, very different development needs. Policy is weak globally. I'm not suggesting that neither Danny nor myself nor the current UK government is in this category, but politicians find long-term thinking really tough. Why? The average duration of a prime minister is 4 years. And if you're talking about fossil fuels, you're talking about building plants that have a 30 to 40-year life. And ideology gets in the way. You know, there is an argument now amongst the free traders that we should have no adjustments for carbon levels in cross-border trade. Others say that cross-border trade is adjustments of the way to actually drive CO2 removal from exported goods, which is something that we would all want. And it is also striking that, you know, as much as people have this high level of interest in climate, it does not cut through certainly at the national ballot box. I'm sure it does with this group, but, you know, I doubt if you look at the Green Party's polling, which is the party, of course, that expresses the purest view on this. They did not do too well in the last election in the UK, and it has been hard to get cut through on these things politically. The other thing, and this relates a little bit to something that Paul said, there's way too much either or in the conversations and not enough both and. I have never seen so much purity of argument. For example, the big argument at the moment, or the big discussion, is how do we start to accelerate carbon removal? Because if we want to get to a net zero world by 2050, the science tells us we need about 2/3 reduction, elimination of reduction of CO2 levels, and 1/3 removal. And it is incredible how many arguments are put in place to actually stop us getting on with natural removal or through carbon capture and storage. There is an ideological objection to this. We don't have time to figure that out. We can certainly set good guidelines, we can make everything incredibly nature positive, but this sense of either or drives us out of the solution space again and again and again. Investment levels are tiny compared to required levels. I think the UK government is spending about 17 billion on climate change, including its overseas commitments. That is great, but it is dwarfed by what is going on, for example, in the COVID response, let alone the recovery. And the final thing is, I think it's a human failing that we constantly underestimate the climate risk and the cost of adaptation to climate change. You know, when we talk about adaptation, people think, oh, this is all about cities in Southeast Asia flooding. It's not. It's cities like New York and London flooding, or enormous movements of people and businesses away from coastal regions. And again, I think we just have this inbuilt concern that we find it very, very hard to adapt. What do we need to do to get to net zero globally if we do want to get to 2050? We need to hit an 11% decarbonisation rate a year to get there. And if you think that COVID basically gave us about an 8% reduction and we can only empty the planes once, we have hugely got to up our game. So what's it going to take for the action decade? For me, it is about forming coalitions of the willing who are prepared to spin the flywheel faster, whether those are national governments coming together, whether those are companies or industry groups, whether those are local councils. It is those who are prepared to break out of that circle of comfort and say, we will aim to go further and faster. And we have to join it up. I am so struck by the number of levers that sit in local government's hands, whether it relates to planning, whether it relates to transport. And I know it's really, really tough at the council level because there's always this great fear of being, you know, JD'd or whatever it is. But, you know, just looking around, High Wycombe have said that new developments have to have a minimum level of forest cover, for example. We can set our own guidelines and essentially move further and faster and join that up with national policy. And I wouldn't underestimate the power of individual action. I mean, too much of the lobbying, if you'll forgive me, is focused at national governments. We almost never think about what town halls do and what they can do. And for me, lobbying local and thinking very hard about individual decisions makes a massive difference. Juliet was saying at the end of the last session about pension funds. It is the best way to have an impact is to pay attention to where your pension fund, whether it's individual or corporate or public sector, is being invested. You know, moving a pound of pension money is 27 times more powerful than anything else. And it is the case now that the pension industry is desperate to invest in a sustainable way. And there are questions about metrics and transparency, but that is a hugely powerful thing we can do. I talked about politicians. I think we have to recognise the political limitations, both the timescales of governments, but also the demands of citizens. It is difficult to come up, and you'll have seen, there was a trial balloon floated a few weeks ago about taxing meat, putting up the cost of mince, etc., and milk. That went down like a lead balloon in some political quarters, yet there are conversations that say that is the right thing to do, but this is really tough for governments to do. Actually using your own purchasing power, making those choices yourselves rather than waiting for governments to regulate might be a way to accelerate that. Veganism, no regulation whatsoever, is now has grown by I think 25% in the first quarter of this year, and now vegan ranges are available in every single supermarket, and that happens simply as an expression of personal behaviour. We talked a bit about trust in the last session. You know, there is a huge amount of distrust in this, quite rightly, because there is a lot of greenwashing. And for me, the regulating, disclosing, making corporate incentives align with environmental incentives is one of the ways to rebuild that trust between individuals and companies. And we've got to scale up some of these technologies. Bill Gates's new book talks about this. You know, we've got to have carbon capture and storage because China is going to keep using gas no matter what we say. But if we want to get them off coal, we're going to have to accept that and scale up carbon capture and storage and hydrogen and make those the Mars missions. Unleash the private finance to do it and unlock the government funding. Government COVID spending 271 billion so far. Money well spent, but you know, let's look at what is facing it in terms of this climate challenge. Massive natural restoration. I think, as we were talking about, food and nature shifts are absolutely vital. And I'd love to see, you know, a climate corp where we're working with young people or indeed old people like me and basically saying, let's go out and really start to restore. Why don't we reforest Salisbury Plain? Can anybody tell me? I live next to Salisbury Plain still. Can't the tanks go through trees? It's clearly a previously forested landscape. There's lots of shrubs growing there, or you know, the scrub that leads to tree restoration. Let's just accept that some parts of this landscape should be retreed and get ourselves involved in doing that. And focus on the opportunity as well as the cost. So often the climate conversation is this really difficult one about costs and trade-offs. There are extraordinary opportunities for profits, for health, for support for communities. There are amazing opportunities if we get this right. And the final thing is, I don't know about you, I find net zero quite a depressing place to aim. The idea that we're aiming for this mathematical balance, which we may or may not be able to hold in check, giving tipping points. Let's focus on climate recovery. Let's go through the 2050s, which is only 30 years away, and talk about how we actually restore the planet. How do we actually start to really get temperatures falling again, get ourselves into a place where we have, you know, a sense of restoration. And I think we've got to find a way to inspire people to show that there is opportunity, that there is hopefulness, and that climate recovery is something that we absolutely can and will achieve. I'll stop there. Great to join you all. Thanks, Danny. What a fantastic initiative to do this today.
Claire, thank you very much indeed. Well, that's tremendous. And it's very helpful to get all those insights. We're almost out of time. There's been a lot of interesting chat. You really got people going on the idea of reforesting Salisbury Plain. I'm not sure you ever suggested when you were the MP. Maybe
I did. And the MOD said, oh my dear, utterly impossible.
Yes. How did that go down?
How did it go, Danny?
The farmers on the plain. But thank you very much. I mean, I think rather than trying to reflect all the questions that have come in, which I wouldn't be able to do, I just wanted to ask you sort of quite a general question, and then I might let our remaining panelists fire a question at you each, and then we'll close. My one is, and it's come up in some of the chat, and people have been suggesting, we need some sort of totemic legislation to commit our nation to this agenda, and beyond, as you say, rather depressing numerical targets. Other jurisdictions have created Future Generations Acts or passed laws which effectively commit all policy to this agenda. Do you think that something like that is appropriate? Would you like to see some commitment on that scale, or do you think it's more about just getting the actual levers of policy pulled in the right direction across the piece?
Danny, and it's easy for me to say this now, but I think we rely an awful lot on regulation to try and change the world. I mean, nobody regulated the internet into existence. There were regulations that supported it, but it was essentially a shift change in the way that people were prepared to communicate with extraordinary results. And so I think this sense of, the future is within us, that this is something that we all innately want to do. And our job is to, at the ballot box, whether it's local or national, vote in political parties that are prepared to commit funding and a regulatory structure to this. But we cannot ignore the fact that we have a massive role to play. And I sometimes think, I'm looking at the chat and people are quite rightly saying we haven't done enough, but we are considered to be amongst the global leaders in regulating for, someone's saying, shame we didn't regulate the internet, indeed, one of my old campaigns. But the point about this power of transformation is there. So I think I don't think we should default to regulation. And here's the problem. Globally, there is no regulatory structure. So we can regulate away all we like on an individual basis or in a regional basis, but there is no regulatory structure that will enforce anything. And that is the problem. Ultimately, this is a voluntary thing. So ultimately, we're going to have to work with the market structure we have, with our own preferences, and with the ballot box to drive this action.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Ariane, if I can get you back on video, have you got a final question for Claire? There's been quite a lot of conversation about the local v national, and Claire was just making the point that actually we should be thinking more about what local councils are doing. So as Wiltshire Council, could you want to challenge her or ask a question?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting point. I think there is a lot more we could do as a council with the right powers, and so that is something which hopefully central government is thinking about and will be working on, because we're a member of different networks like the Countryside Climate Network, for example, that's putting forward an argument for local councils to have more powers on this agenda. And I think with those powers we could do more. So it is about working together and getting rid of any barriers that are getting in the way at any level, really.
Can I also throw in something, Danny, which was something that happened in my watch, not yours, but we stripped out a ton of funding for local government when it came to expertise at the officer level. And so I often think councils are trying to do far too much with too little resource. And actually you can tell just from the expertise on this chat box, there's a lot of hugely knowledgeable people sitting at the local level. So actually pushing for some of that funding, some of that resource to get back in close to the delivery, I think would be a really positive thing to do.
Very much agree. Okay, thank you, Ariane. Nick, last word from you, please.
Claire, thank you for your comments. In my group, the issue of carbon tax came up, and I don't want to go into the engineering of such a thing, but is it a worthwhile endeavour, a global carbon tax? or is it in the too difficult box?
It's never going to happen. So I think so again, we have no global taxation on anything, and there is no structure to deliver it. So it is, and by the way, I think people who talk about carbon tax are often talking because they don't want to act now. They want to push it into, I mean, it was striking to me that really right-wing Republicans advocate for carbon taxes. I think carbon taxes are hugely valuable in the national economy. They're part of the reason we drove coal off the grid. And interesting, the ETS scheme is starting to deliver after 2 decades of inaction. But that carbon taxes can be very inequitable, as we know. And I actually think the intellectual argument that many constituents used to make about taxing rebates is a good one. But I just don't think it's going to happen that globally, Nick. And I think we have to, tax and regulate on our own levels. But basically look at trade deals and carbon border tax adjustments, where we're actually trying to stimulate these changes, for me, are the way to drive that international behaviour.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, we've hit 4 o'clock, and I'm very, very pleased with today and grateful to everybody. Claire, thank you for your time this afternoon. Thank you to the panel. And obviously, thank you to everybody who's attended. We've had a really, really good turnout and a very, very high degree of expert engagement, and only, in fact, hardly any pointless criticisms or fantasy ideas. So it's all been just very constructive and very, very helpful for me. And I do see my job as to try and represent as many of these views as I can to government and in Parliament. So let us all keep in touch. There was a very good question came up about how to sustain this conversation. Obviously, we can do it again in this format in due course, but between now and then, I'd be very much open to suggestions about platforms and forums that we can create to enable an ongoing conversation. As Claire just said, the expertise is not in town halls and government, it's in our communities. So we need to build on what people know and can do, and we can together come up with the right strategy for our country. So thank you all very much indeed. Have a good rest of the afternoon. And thank you. We'll all talk again soon. Bye-bye.